I'll be honest, I've never been a huge fan of Dark Souls. Now before you get too angry, let me clarify that it's not because I don't like the games, rather it's just that I haven't had a lot of experience with the series or the Souls-like genre as a whole. Before making this video, I had played the first few hours of both Dark Souls Remastered and Elden Ring. However, as someone who had never played a Souls-like game before, I found myself easily overwhelmed by the depth and complexity of the game's mechanics. It wasn't that I didn't like the games or wasn't willing to learn the mechanics, it was more that when I started those games I had other things going on in my life, so I didn't have the time or energy to devote to mastering a game as big and complex as Elden Ring. I always wanted to give From Software's titles another go, but every time I would consider it, I would find myself not having the energy to give these games another shot. And so both Dark Souls Remastered and Elden Ring had been banished to my backlog to hopefully be played sometime in the distant future. But then, a little game called Another Crab's Treasure captured my attention, and everything changed. This game was originally announced 2 years ago in an Indie World presentation, but I only heard about it from the Nintendo Direct Partners Showcase earlier this year. The game takes the familiar Souls-like genre and turns it into a colorful ocean romp where you're a crab trying to get his shell back. It immediately caught my eye when I saw the trailer, and it was something that not a lot of people were talking about after the Direct, at least from what I saw. I had this game on my radar though, and I knew that if any game was going to get me into the Souls-like genre, or Shells-like as the developers at Aggro Crab called it would be Another Crab's Treasure. The game launched late last month, and sure enough, I fell in love with it. More than that though, after beating Another Crab's Treasure, I went back to both Elden Ring and Dark Souls Remastered, and I've been having a lot of fun with those games too. Another Crab's Treasure has so much to offer from its approachable gameplay systems, fun art style, and surprisingly deep story. Fair warning though, there will be spoilers for the entire story and all the main bosses in this video, so if you don't want to be spoiled, maybe don't watch the video all the way through. I know that goes against the greedy YouTuber inside of me.
Hello, I like money.
But I just think this game is that good, I wouldn't want to ruin it for anyone. Anyways, this is why you need to play Another Crab's Treasure. The setup for this game is pretty simple. You're just a little hermit crab who got his shell stolen by a loan shark because of taxes? You can immediately tell the tone of this game just by the opening. It doesn't take itself too seriously and has a lot of comedy in the writing, but it also has a deeper message under the surface. Get it? So Krill, our main protagonist of the game, has to venture into the depths of the ocean to get his shell back. It's a pretty simple setup, but it's also one that leads into a much greater story that I'll get into later. In the early hours of the game, you'll be exploring the shallows where you discover that many creatures have been overtaken by gunk, a pollutant that has been zombifying sea creatures, turning them into killing machines. Here in the shallows is where the game teaches you about the basic mechanics of the game, and you get to fight a few bosses. Unlike most other Souls-likes, Another Crab's Treasure has an emphasis on platforming as well as combat. Most of the exploring you'll do requires you to run, jump, swim, and grapple around different environments filled to the brim with enemies. And you'll use moon snail shells you find around the world as fast travel points that are also where you heal and level up. Now I know the first thing that many people did when first seeing this game was compare it to Elden Ring and Dark Souls. Heck, even the game does it by putting in references and Easter eggs to a bunch of Souls-like and indie games. I don't want to compare this game to Dark Souls too much, since comparisons are often what lead discussions about funny crab games to transform into tactical war zones in the comments section. However, I see Another Crab's Treasure as sort of a jumping off point for the Souls-like genre, so it's almost impossible to not compare them at least somewhat. Especially since one of my big points in this video is how the game got me into Elden Ring and Dark Souls because of its approachability. So while I will continue to bring up From Software's titles in this video, it will mostly be as a reference point for those who are maybe not as familiar with this game. That being said, combat works kind of similarly to Elden Ring and other From Software titles, but is very much simplified. You're given a fork to use as a weapon that can do normal and charged attacks. This is the only weapon you'll have access to throughout the entire game, but it can be upgraded using items you'll find while exploring. The big thing about combat that sets this game apart from other Souls-like games is the shell mechanic. Shells act as your shield and let you block oncoming attacks. While in Elden Ring getting attacked while blocking with a shield can still damage you a bit, shells will completely block any damage you receive. However, they can only take so many attacks before breaking, requiring you to find another shell. Shells are found all throughout the environment, and there are 69 different ones. Nice. Each shell has a different durability, weight, and umami ability. These umami abilities can do special attacks, give you buffs, heal you, etc. Not every shell has its own individual ability, rather as you progress through the game, you will find shells with abilities you've seen before but now with a different weight or higher durability. The shell mechanic makes this game unique from other Souls-likes, and it's fun to change up your shell to try a different strategy for a boss or hard group of enemies. Microplastics are the main currency in this game that you get from defeating enemies or selling items you find. However, if you die, you will drop your microplastics where you were killed and have to get them back before dying again, or they will be lost forever. These microplastics can be used to level up your character's stats and buy things from shops in the main hub world, New Carcinia. This is something pretty much directly ripped from Dark Souls and Elden Ring, but I still think it's a genius mechanic. Having to decide between buying items from shops and leveling up adds a lot of strategy to how you approach the game. I think this is especially true for Another Crab's Treasure. Since all of the shops and all the items in said shops are available as soon as you unlock them, there's a lot more you need to think about when managing your microplastics, particularly in the early game. There's going to be a ton of items you can't even dream of affording when you first look at the shops. However, they're good items, so what will you do? Will you save up your microplastics to buy a shell of the Among Us crewmate that you can use throughout the entire game? Or will you instead use those microplastics to upgrade a few of your stat points that can help you out right now? Most RPGs have experience and money as a different resource, but Souls-like games like this one merge the two to make you strategize how you want to spend your rewards from defeating enemies. I also didn't really know where to fit this into the script, but you can find stowaways throughout the world who will give you buffs for your stats or give you special abilities. However, you can only hold 3 of them at once, and they each take up a certain amount of your stowaway capacity. This means you have 3 slots, but may not be able to hold 3 stowaways depending on how much of your capacity they take up, requiring you to strategize how you will use that capacity. After exploring the shallows for a bit, you'll encounter the first main boss of the game, Nephro, Captain of the Guard. This is where you're first introduced to the shell mechanic, and I honestly found the fight hard when I first played this game, but it was probably just because I was still getting used to shells and the controls. After making your way to Fort Slacktide, Krill talks to the Duchess about paying his taxes to get his shell back. He also expresses his concerns about the gunk, you know, making everyone crazy, but she doesn't seem to care all that much. She then sends him on a quest to a nearby cave. This is where you unlock the hook and learn about the umami abilities. At the end of the cave, you'll fight a boss, and then you find the moon snail's domain. This is where the moon snails can use umami crystals you find through exploring and defeating enemies to grant you new abilities in the form of a skill tree. Upon returning to Fort Slacktide, you find that everything is a bit dark. Literally. The guards blocking the entrance are gone, so you're able to fully explore the area. Once you get to the end, you find the Duchess, who is now overtaken by the gunk as she tries to kill you. She has attacks that can afflict the gunk effect, which deals a ton of damage to you over time, like a poison. This boss was the first big roadblock I encountered when playing this game for the first time, and it took some backtracking to level up and upgrade Krill before finally beating her. Once you do kill her, you are given an adaptation, which uses your umami charges to do a special move. There are about a dozen different adaptations you find throughout the game, most of which are obtained through defeating bosses and special enemies. Some of them have uses outside of combat though, which can let you access new areas Metroidvania style. I never found myself using these a whole lot in combat, or the umami abilities as a whole, to be honest. I think it's cool how for this game they combine melee and sorcery gameplay styles from games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls. However, I found myself pretty much solely relying on blocking and doing melee attacks for combat, especially in the late game, but I'll go more into that later. You then encounter the Lone Shark again, who runs off with your shell to the city of New Carcinia. This city acts as the hub world of the game, where you'll return to several times for the story. It also holds shops to buy shells, items, and stowaways, there's a blacksmith to upgrade your weapon, and you can upgrade your stowaway capacity as well as buy shell insurance, which allows you to respawn with the shell you've selected if you have the insurance for it. Once you looked at the shops, all of a sudden, trash starts falling from the sky, and oh boy, it's trash day. A giant cereal box crashes into the ground, which has an incomplete map on the back of it leading to a treasure. The citizens of the city want to find the treasure for themselves to make a fortune, but the rich mayor Roland wants to take the money for himself to improve the city. The citizens oppose this, so Roland decides to make it a competition to see who can complete the map and find the treasure first. You find your shell at a local pawn shop in the city, and the owner, Pronathan, says that if you find the treasure, he will trade it for your shell. And this is where the game truly opens up. I wouldn't say that everything before this is a tutorial, but once you start the competition for the treasure, you start to see the direction of where the game and its story are going. And at this point, pretty much all of the game's mechanics are available to you. It does take you a few hours to get to this point, as the game gradually teaches you about combat, shells, umami, and the skill tree. I could see this being frustrating on a repeat playthrough or for those familiar with the genre, but for me who was completely new to this type of game, I found it very helpful to gradually unlock new mechanics and truly get to learn them before being thrust into a huge challenge. And I think that's what made me put down the From Software titles I had dabbled with in the past. The mechanics in those games are very deep and complex, much more than another Crab's Treasure. And the games I played at least didn't fully explain a lot of the mechanics well enough to where I felt like I had a grasp on them before going into the absurd challenges the games thrust you into. It isn't necessarily a bad thing to not fully explain the mechanics of a game and have the players figure things out for themselves, but it's also important to give them breathing room to learn those mechanics on their own. Between Dark Souls Remastered and Elden Ring, the only two From Software games I've played, and I'm still working on them at the time of making this video, I think Elden Ring suffers from this a lot less. Because the game is open world without a clear intended path for you to take, you could explore just the opening area for hours without even finding the first required boss. This allows you time to learn the mechanics of the game in practice. However, I still think you will find a lot of challenges from the normal enemies in the early hours of the game on your first playthrough. On the other hand, I could see someone put down Dark Souls Remastered after only an hour or two because there is so much being thrown at you all at once. With that comes little to no explanation or time spent with the mechanics before you're forcefully thrown into the video game equivalent of falling into a wood chipper. None of this is inherently bad game design, but it can be hard for new players to adapt to this playstyle when they've never played a game in this genre before. This is why I love how Another Crab's Treasure lets the players breathe and learn the mechanics before requiring them to bash their head against a wall to beat a strong group of enemies or a tough boss. The early hours aren't a cakewalk by any means. New players will surely die at least a fair few times, but it's not like the early hours of Elden Ring, for instance, where everything can and will kick your butt, and getting through it while learning the mechanics is more of an endurance test than a tutorial. Krill decides that he's going to find the treasure to get his shell back, so he has to find the first part of the map. This leads him to the Sands Between, a large open area brimming with things to discover. However, you'll quickly learn that if you stray too far from the life preservers marking a straightforward path, danger awaits. Pagurus the Ravenous is a giant crab that will emerge from the sand and absolutely destroy you. You're very much urged to stay on the main path and not attempt to fight him, but it is possible to beat him if you're strong enough. By following the path, you'll find the Expired Grove. This area is filled with lush greenery and these stupid long-range crabs that continue to annoy me even when I was backtracking at a higher level. The main path here is pretty obvious, but there is not a lot of optional exploration to do here. However, it does end with one of my favorite boss fights in the game, Ikey Imitation Crab. This boss uses chopsticks like samurai swords as you fight on a literal sushi boat, so it's immediately up there for me. Other than the presentation, it's still a fun fight though, where I felt like I truly had to learn the patterns to succeed my first time around. After you defeat the Imitation Crab, you get the first piece of the map and you're also able to access a new area of the grove. Now, I don't know if I just completely missed this or if I simply forgot to come back to it, but I discovered this area much later in the game than I think I was supposed to. Exploring this area is completely optional, but you do fight the Grove Keeper Topoda at the end, who unlocks a pretty useful feature. He can upgrade your adaptations by using umami crystals, but I didn't end up doing that all that much. One, because I ended up finding him pretty late in the game, but also because I rarely used adaptations in the first place. However, it is cool how the umami crystals have uses both in the skill tree and to upgrade adaptations, so you have to think about how you want to spend them. The next piece of the map is located in a new area, Flotsam Vale, which has an aesthetic in stark contrast to everything seen in the game up to this point. It isn't a shallow sandy shore with bright blue water, a colorful bustling city, or a lush green grove. It's dreary and filled with trash and pollution. Everything is brown and unappealing to look at. There's gunk everywhere that will end in your death if you fall into it. Enemies will spit gunk from their insides out at you, which is honestly kinda sad. This new area also marks a minor difficulty spike, at least for me when I first played it. It's nothing too crazy, but I found myself dying a lot and having to run past hordes of enemies to get my microplastics back too many times. It also doesn't help that it's pretty unclear where you have to go to find the second piece of the map, and where you do have to go is almost hidden in a corner. Luckily, I just happened to go in the intended direction, but one of my friends spent a long time exploring this area and had a hard time finding the intended path. There's also a secret exit you can find that will lead you to a back entrance of the Expired Grove. This loops back around to the sushi boat and is how I discovered the optional section of the grove in the first place. Unfortunately, this was not long before I beat the game, so it wasn't super useful. Going back to the objective, you'll then go into a cave where you move around both in the water and above the surface, which is pretty cool and one of the only areas in the game where you can do this. At the end, you'll fight the Ceviche sisters, which provide the only fight in the game where you're put against two enemies at once with the same health bar. However, I found this boss pretty easy and beat it on only my second or third try. Upon beating the sisters, you get the second part of the map and then discover that the third and final piece is held by Pagurus the Ravenous. Yep, this monstrous force has been giving you trouble the entire game, and now you're required to finally defeat him to progress. He was pretty hard for me too, and while he isn't my favorite boss fight in the game, he's definitely up there due to his difficulty alone. I think out of all the bosses in the game, this one took me the longest amount of time to complete, but it felt so good to finally defeat him. Now the path to the treasure is clear, so it's time to follow the map and get to that treasure before Roland or anyone else can. However, when you get to the docks at Flotsam Vale, you see that Roland already has a boat and is on his way to where the map leads, and the only boat that you can find is out of power. After this, a new area of Flotsam Vale opens up to you where you encounter many enemies using electricity attacks to stun you. At the end, you find Voltai the Accumulator, who was probably the easiest boss in the game for me. Granted, this was because there is a stowaway you can find in the area right before the boss that makes you immune to electric attacks. And because Voltai mostly uses those when attacking, I was able to beat her on my first attempt, no problem. However, I did think this boss was a cool set piece at the very least. Upon defeating her, you obtain the Electrocute adaptation, which can be used to start the ship, as well as open up a few new areas around the map that have these electric gate things. We meet up with all the main side characters on the boat who are also looking for the treasure. Despite all of them wanting the treasure for themselves, Krill and these side characters have been working together so far, and you see them a few times in the different areas throughout the game. I've neglected to properly mention them until now because up to this point, they really haven't had that much importance to the plot, but they all have their motivations for wanting to find the treasure. Nema wants to support her family and her business selling stowaways. Conch wants to provide more funding to the museum. Kayin doesn't want the treasure but just wants to stop Roland from doing his Rolandy things. And finally, Firth wants to help the overall economy and people in need in New Carcinia, which will surely have no implications for the rest of the story. On the boat ride to the treasure, all these characters share their motivations and they agree that they will split the treasure with each other if they find it so they can all achieve their goals. However, Krill says that he can't split the treasure because he needs to give the whole sum of it to Pronathan to get his shell back. They all ask what's so special about his shell, and Krill can't give a good answer. He just wants to get back to his normal life of solitude in the tide pools. Nema doesn't agree with this and says that maybe Krill losing his shell is good for him in the end, to gain some perspective on the world. But before the discussion can go any further, they arrive at the mouth of the drain, and it's time for the confrontation with Roland. Upon scaling their boat, which is made partially out of a pinball machine, you see that Roland has already begun extracting the treasure from an ocean chasm. You and the other citizens looking for the treasure confront Roland, but he sends Inkerton, his right-hand squid, to deal with everyone else while Roland fights Krill personally. This is a pretty fun and challenging fight, and the fact that it takes place in a pinball machine makes it automatically great. And now, this is where the game starts to get real. Roland seems to fall into the chasm once you defeat him, but he ends up falling on top of the treasure that's now in his possession. Roland tells everyone how he just wanted to help the city, but Krill tells him to shut up and rants about how he's been working harder than everyone to get this treasure and his life back. Then, in a fit of rage, he jumps onto the treasure chest, sending the boat and everyone on it into the chasm below. We see a cute little cutscene showing Krill growing up in his shell and using it for shelter and safety in his early days? Months? I don't want to say years because, well, he's a crab, but you know what I mean. Then Krill wakes up in the deep ocean, which is basically just the depths from Tears of the Kingdom. He finds Firth, who was upset with Krill for sending all of them into the depths over a treasure that is revealed to be nothing but worthless paper that is useless and cannot help anyone anywhere. Moving on. An evil voice talks to Krill and tells him to fight against the world since he thinks it's all messed up anyway, but Krill just gives up and succumbs to the enemies attacking him. That is before he is saved by Nema and the two of them have a heart-to-heart. Krill starts to realize that in his old life, he didn't do anything. He just stayed alone in his shell, ignorant of the world around him that was being faced with pollution and destruction. He comes to terms with the fact that even if he were to get his shell back, he wouldn't be able to comfortably return to the life he once held so dear. And that's just life. Despite how comfortable you may feel with your current situation, there's always going to be change or something that challenges your worldview. There's going to be something in life that sends you on an adventure whether you like it or not. That could be in a literal sense with Krill, or it could be figuratively or mentally. I think it's time to finally talk in depth about Nema's character, as she is pretty much the antithesis of Krill and his character. Krill has lived his entire life comfortable and content. He may have had struggles in the beginning as shown in the flashback, but he ultimately has the life he wants and is okay with doing nothing. Nema, on the other hand, has had to work her entire life to get what she wants. She's searching for the treasure not for personal gain, but to support her family. She wants to give her kids a better life and support them in the best way she can. Despite how tough and sassy she may seem at times, she's very much a selfless character. Krill, on the other hand, is pretty selfish if you think about it. All he wants is to get his shell back, and he puts that desire above everyone else throughout the story. When the group is talking about splitting the treasure, he doesn't want to. If he gets the treasure, he technically has the right to do this, but when everyone else has already agreed to split it with one another so they can all achieve their goals, it comes off a bit selfish. Assuming for a second that the treasure was worth something to them, I'm sure that Krill would have been able to convince Pronathan to give him his shell back even with a fraction of the earnings if he tried hard enough. And he still would have been able to split the treasure with everyone. However, Krill doesn't even consider this option because of his selfishness and immediately turns down the offer. Again, when confronting Roland, he leaps onto the treasure without even thinking about how everyone could be sent to their doom. And this comes to a head when Firth is upset with him and Krill finally starts to realize how his selfishness has been affecting everyone. Now, I'm not trying to say that Krill is a bad person or a bad character or anything. Lots of people can have flaws without realizing it or trying to be malicious. That's just how people work in real life. Sure, this game has comically evil characters like Roland, but no one in this game is a saint without any flaws. Not even Nema, who berates Krill for not agreeing to share the treasure even though that's his decision. Despite this and Krill sending everyone into the depths, she still saves him at his lowest moment in the entire game. She could have let him die, which some would argue he kinda deserved, but she doesn't. This scene shows that even though Nema and Krill are polar opposites, they have a lot more in common than they think. They're both fighting against the world for a better life, and this is what helps Krill start to realize the error of his ways. His character arc isn't complete by this point, he still prioritizes getting his shell back above all else, but he's willing to help the others get out of the mess he made. Whew, that was a lot of character analysis. Let's move on for a bit. Krill recovers from almost becoming fish food and finds Conch, who tells him that even though the treasure was worthless, there may be something here in the depths that could make them rich. Before telling Krill too much though, Conch says that they need to find a way out of here first. So now it's time to explore the darkness of the depths, or the Unfathom as it's actually called. This area is very dark, but you can light it up as you progress and defeat dangerous enemies. Once you get further in, you find Conch, who shows you an ancient relic that is literally just styrofoam. However, he says that this is a piece of the old ocean, an ancient city that has been long lost. He says that they should continue moving forward in hopes of finding this ancient city as well as a way home. Continuing on is more of the same area, but there is a shell you can find that is literally an N64 cartridge of Aggro Crab's other game, Going Under. I haven't played that game, but I'm considering buying and playing it soon because of how much I loved Another Crab's Treasure. Anyways, you find a moon snail shell in the distance, and once you get to it, you realize that it isn't what it seems. When you try to interact with it, it spits you out, and Petro, the false moon, rises from the sands to fight you. This was a pretty fun fight, and I loved parrying it when it was doing its spinny attack. Around this point in the game is also where I started using the tiny fish stowaway to help deal an extra bit of damage. They also helped a lot by keeping the balance meter up. So with this and other bosses later in the game, I was able to easily fill up the balance meter at least once, if not multiple times during a fight. Oh yeah, I kinda forgot to talk about the balance meter. When you do a ton of attacks in a small-ish interval of time, it will start filling up the balance meter. However, if you take too long to continue attacking, the meter will drain. Once you fill the meter up and land a charged attack, it will knock the enemy over and allow you to get a bunch of hits in, or do a cool finisher move if you have that ability. Once you beat the false moon, you're able to teleport back to town and take a breather. But first, Conch finally tells Krill about the old ocean and the Perfect Whirl. The Perfect Whirl was a shell made by hermit sorcerers that had incredibly strong umami abilities. They used this artifact to keep the sea in balance, but the king of the old ocean became scared of its powers, so he took the shell and sealed it below his kingdom after banishing the hermits. Conch tells Krill that if they can find the Perfect Whirl in the old ocean, they will become incredibly wealthy and Krill can get his shell back. Upon hearing that last part, of course, Krill unsurprisingly agrees, and then they set out to find the entrance to the old ocean. After a little bit of exploring, you find the Abyssal Plains, which is honestly my least favorite area in the game. There are these giant crabs that shoot lasers at you, as well as these squid that can hypnotize you into moving towards them, which is a deadly combination when trying to explore while staying behind cover to dodge the lasers. The giant crabs have massive health bars too, so I found there was no point in trying to kill them when multiple are trying to shoot you at once. However, it's very difficult to properly explore when all of that is going on and you're still in a pretty dark area. After trying to find where you're supposed to go on my own and facing many deaths, I ultimately caved and looked up where to go because this area was just that annoying and difficult to navigate through. You then find Chitin, who is miraculously alive and is next to the body of one of the giant crabs. She says how she wants to find the old ocean too, and you continue exploring until you hear some familiar voices. Roland and Inkerton are arguing about, everything that's happened recently, not much, and Inkerton straight up just shoots Roland. Man, I would hate to fight this guy right now, and we're going into the boss battle. Jokes aside, this might be my favorite fight in the game, to be honest. Inkerton as a character is just cool. Aside from that though, his fight is really fun as he tries to crack your shell, shoot you, and blind you with his ink. It's a fast-paced and difficult fight, and even though I died a fair few times, I didn't feel at all frustrated because of how fun he was to fight. I'll get more into the difficulty later, but I also found this was the last genuinely hard fight in the game on my first playthrough, which makes it all the sweeter. Once you beat him, you move forward and find the Shellevator down to the old ocean, the final area of the game. It's a pretty lengthy and difficult area with a lot of branching paths and exploring to do. As you move forward, you discover Carcinia, the Bleached city. There are cleaning supplies all over the place here, and everything is white from the bleach. You also discovered that the identity of the evil voice is the personification of the souls of creatures that have died because of the gunk and pollution. At the end of the area, you find the throne room with Kamshka, the Bleached King. In typical Souls-like fashion, this boss has two phases, but it makes a lot of sense here. Kamshka is very similar to the crab enemies you find in the old ocean that climb out of their skin and require you to fight another version of them. I found this boss pretty easy though, and I beat it after only 2 or 3 deaths, but I'll talk more about the difficulty at the end of the game in a little bit. Once you beat him, it's time to jump into the toilet, to the bottom of the drain. You and Conch finally find the perfect whirl, but before you can grab it...
Oh, god damn it!
Drivel.
Chitin is being overtaken by Praia Dubia, the ocean's agony. This is what I thought was the final boss when I was first playing, but hoo boy was I wrong. This is a pretty fun boss fight that requires you to beat a wave of crabs before being able to attack Praia Dubia itself. Normally, I don't like bosses that make you wait a long time or require you to do a lot before being able to attack it, because sometimes it just feels like artificial difficulty or lengthening the boss for no reason. Sonic Superstars. However, I don't mind it here because the fight is really fun, and once you hit the actual boss, you're able to absolutely wail on it. The boss also has a second phase where you just fight Praia Dubia itself. I thought it was harder than Kamshka, but I was still able to beat it in just a few tries. Then, before you get close to the perfect world, the game tells you that after this point, you won't be able to save the game, so you need to prepare for the final confrontation. Whew. Krill finds Chitin on the ground who is hurt after being a puppet for Praia Dubia. She tells Krill that there is still hope to save the ocean, and Krill decides that he's going to use the perfect whirl to heal Chitin. However, before he can grab it, a familiar face makes another appearance. Firth puts on the perfect whirl and says that he wants to use this new power to help New Carcinia, and then he blasts up into the air. Krill chases after him and they end up on Trash Island. Firth wants to sink the entire island onto New Carcinia to create an economic boom. However, the trash will only end up gunking more people, and it doesn't take a genius to understand that if he sinks Trash Island onto New Carcinia and everyone is rich, no one will be. So Krill decides to fight Firth to stop him from destroying the city. Firth has a really fun boss fight, and all of his mid-fight dialogue is filled with the humorous writing I love from this game. Unsurprisingly, he also has a second phase, basically turning him into a god. Now before I talk about the difficulty of this fight, let me tell you about the personal experience I had while fighting it. So when I was first playing this game, I was up late one night trying to beat it, and I was having a lot of trouble fighting Firth. However, I'm not sure if the boss was actually hard or if it was just because 1, I was up late that night, 2, I had had a long day at work and school earlier that day, and 3, my allergies that day had been the worst they'd been all year, and I was really struggling. I ended up quitting for the night because I was tired, and in the morning, I did some exploring in areas I'd missed before fighting him again. But when I did fight him, I beat him on like my second or third try. I was level 54, so I don't think I was overpowered, but I still found him kinda easy when I attempted him again. So I'm not sure if I was actually overpowered or if it was just because the first time I was trying to fight him, I was kinda struggling. Regardless, I still thought the boss was really fun and a fitting end to the game. Once Krill beats Firth, he puts on the perfect whirl, but instead of using it to stop Trash Island from sinking or to save Chitin, he uses it against Firth and sends the island plummeting into New Carcinia. Krill wakes up and sees the trash-filled city. He feels bad about what he's done, but he knows that if he didn't stop Firth, it would have ended up worse. Firth gets crushed by a falling boot that we saw him next to in the beginning of the game, and Krill tells Nema that Conch is dead. He finds Pronathan and asks for his shell back since he made all this trash rain on the city, but he still refuses, so Krill promptly kills him. He then puts his shell back on, ending the game. The final cutscene has the narrator explaining how the world is never going to stop changing. People are never going to stop suffering. The world is too far gone to fully reverse everything done both physically and systematically. However, people will and should continue to fight in whatever way they can. Whether it's just a kind act or a simple gesture, there is a way for everyone on this earth to change the world for the better. It's the kindness from others that gives the world its meaning, that makes it worth saving. Same with Krill and Nema. Krill and Firth aren't that different than you may think. They both have their selfish reasons for doing what they do, and they're willing to hurt others to get what they want. They each have their way of defending and normalizing that selfishness. In Firth's case, it's by claiming that what he does is for the good of others, and Krill defends his actions because he's a victim of getting his home stolen. However, the difference between these two characters is that in the end, Krill realizes that his home isn't all he made it up to be. That there's so much more to the world and so many people suffering that it's hard to just ignore back in the tide pools. He isn't a perfect person by the end. I mean, he still makes a huge mistake by letting Trash Island sink onto New Carcinia, but in the final scene of the game, in an act of pure selflessness, Krill gives his shell, the thing he's been fighting for this entire time, to someone in need as he goes on a new adventure. He's realized that he doesn't need the shell for himself anymore, and that it would be much better used as another crab's treasure. The messaging of this game is not subtle by any means. It's abundantly clear that this game's story is an allegorical tale critiquing ocean pollution and capitalism. There are so many things sprinkled throughout the game hinting at its message, like the currency being microplastics and not the organic hard kelp anymore. Most people should be able to pick this up even from the beginning, but maybe that's a good thing. I think despite how the writers made their points here, the messaging is very important, which is why it doesn't have to be subtle. It serves as a call to action for the player to not stay complacent with the world and communicates how anyone can change the world with simple gestures. I did not go into this game thinking that it would present serious issues in such a unique and creative way like this, but I'm glad that it did. The overall tone of this game is both comedic and melancholy, and I love stories that can do that. The game can balance the writing to be both cleverly funny and emotionally impactful in a way that only the best stories can do. All in all, the story of Another Crab's Treasure is incredible. However, my love for this game is not carried solely by the story. The combat is simple enough for pretty much anyone to understand, but it has a lot of depth and complexity to it to keep things interesting without being overly complicated. That's not to say that combat in other Souls-like games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls is bad because it's too complex though. I think this game, despite being in the same genre as From Software's titles, is attempting to attract a different audience than those games do. Elden Ring and Dark Souls are targeted toward hardcore gamers, and the developers want to give them a challenge in a dark, gritty setting. On the other hand, Another Crab's Treasure is in a bright, colorful fish world that has simpler combat, but can still be difficult. This game aims to introduce new players into the Souls-like genre while also being a fun romp for veterans of that genre, and for that, I commend it. The game is not a cakewalk by any means, but it's important to realize that I found a lot of the bosses hard, especially the early ones, because I was new to the genre. However, by the end, it felt like it was kind of too easy. Now, I think this might have been because I just got good at the game or whatever towards the end. When I went back to the beginning of this game to grab footage of the early areas, I found the bosses that gave me a lot of trouble a lot easier on replay. This makes sense as generally you want your game to get harder as it goes on, but because I found the end bosses kind of easy and I associated the earlier bosses as being a lot harder, it made the difficulty kind of weird in my mind. To me, it seemed like the game only got easier over time instead of harder, but going back after beating the game, I found the early bosses easy too. I'm sure the end of the game wasn't easy for everyone, but I feel like this could lead to the entire game feeling easy for pre-existing fans of the Souls-like genre. I think a large part of why I felt the game got easier over time was because the blocking mechanic given by shells makes it easy to tank a bunch of attacks without any consequence or damage dealt to you. If you have a shell with high durability or the skill that lets you regain shell health by attacking, this makes the endgame bosses easier than they should be because you can just block. In Dark Souls and Elden Ring, if you're blocking with your shield and an enemy hits you, it decreases your stamina, which is also what you use to attack. And to make your stamina return faster, you have to not block with your shield. This makes it so you can't just block every attack and wait for an opening. You have to be strategic about when you block and when you attack, adding more depth to the combat. You're punished for simply trying to block all attacks coming from enemies because that means that you can't attack yourself. Another Crab's Treasure doesn't have a mechanic like this though, other than shell health, which I already concluded is pretty easy to work around for the final few fights. This is why I thought the game got easier over time, because I was able to learn how to use the blocking to my advantage. Versus when I was first starting the game, I wasn't used to this combat style and ended up trying to dodge more than I was blocking, so it made the early fights harder. I think if they added some way to make Krill have a balance meter like the enemies in the game, where you're punished by blocking too much, it would have made the game more difficult and the combat more strategic. But maybe not doing something like this was an intentional game design to make the mechanics more simple and the overall difficulty easier, and that's okay. I personally don't mind if a game is a tad easy, especially if it makes it so more fans like me can get into this genre. I mean, look at my wall and what do you see? Yeah, mostly Nintendo, so I'm not used to dealing with any crazy difficulty here. However, I could see how this could turn hardcore Souls-like fans away from this game or leave them disappointed in the difficulty by the end. Being able to beat the endgame bosses in just a few tries and not wasting a bunch of time bashing my head against a wall isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, there's something about trying difficult fights over and over again and learning the patterns that are fun to all the Souls-like fans out there. Some might call it masochism, I call it an average Tuesday. This isn't exclusive to Souls-like games though, as Cuphead and Metroid Dread are some of my favorite games of all time because of their difficulty. Each boss fight feels harder than the last, and to beat most of them requires you to learn the patterns and become good at the video game. By the end, you'll be fighting the literal devil himself, and it might take dozens of tries to beat, but when you do beat him, it feels like you've truly mastered the game. At the end of Another Crab's Treasure, I didn't feel like I had mastered the game, I felt like I took advantage of it. What is this, a bad relationship? And to be completely transparent with you, I don't think I would be critiquing this game being too easy if it wasn't a Souls-like game that is meant to be brutally difficult. Like, by normal video game standards, this game is at least decently difficult. Don't get me wrong, I still love Another Crab's Treasure, but I just wish it was a bit harder towards the end, or there were mechanics to stop you from just blocking all the time. I've neglected to mention this until now, but there are accessibility options in the settings to make the game even easier if you want to. These include more shell durability, less damage taken, lowering enemy health, etc. There's also the ability to give Krill a literal gun to one-shot any enemy in the game, which is hilarious. I'm glad that these options are here, as it makes it so anyone can enjoy this game regardless of their experience with the genre or skill level. I think this game takes great strides in providing an experience that anyone can enjoy, which is a welcome feature. However, I don't want that to be all this game is known for, since that's what a lot of people have been talking about when it comes to this game online. I don't want Souls-like fans to be turned off from this game because of how easy you can make it. It's not as hard as Dark Souls or Elden Ring by any means, but I still think hardcore fans of those games can have a great time with this one. I just wish that there was an option to make the game harder as well and make the accessibility options more of a difficulty slider. For instance, you can make the enemy's health lower or higher depending on how you want to play the game. This way, almost everyone who plays this game can have the challenge that they want. As I said though, I still think all fans of this genre should give the game a go, just don't expect it to be the most challenging Souls-like game out there. The soundtrack of this game is also pretty great. It has a lot of fitting and catchy themes for the town, in battles, and in the areas you explore. The game's OST can be serene while exploring the vast ocean and intense while fighting a tough battle. I'm not the best at explaining how music is good or why I like it, but I've been listening to the OST while writing the script and editing this video, and it's been an amazing listen. I've been using the soundtrack throughout this video, and even if you can't play the game, I still think you should at least give the soundtrack a listen because it's great. Now, up to this point, I've had almost nothing but praise for this game other than my gripes with the difficulty. However, no game is perfect, and this game has its fair share of issues, mostly having to deal with performance. The game can freeze and lag at times, even on PC where I played it. I've also heard some people having issues with their save files on Game Pass and losing a ton of progress. I never personally experienced that, but I'm sure that by now it's been fixed since the game has been out for about a month now. The Nintendo Switch version has also been receiving a lot of criticism for, well, being the Switch version. Other than performance, the lock-on feature is kind of broken sometimes and will focus on a random enemy far away instead of the one right in front of me without me doing anything. It can be annoying at times, but I found myself able to power through it and it didn't hurt the gameplay experience all that much. And that's pretty much all I have to say in terms of criticisms. I know it's hard to take seriously, but this game is just that good in my opinion. I guess one thing I could point out is that the combat is pretty simple compared to other Souls-likes when you boil it down, but I honestly think that's a good thing because it makes the game more approachable. I have almost nothing but praise for this game, and when I got around to beating it, I didn't want it to end. The developers over at AggroCrab thoroughly impressed me with this one, and I'm ecstatic to see what they put out next. I also really need to get around to playing Going Under because I really love this game that much. Maybe that'll be another video for the future. Another Crab's Treasure is one of those special games that only comes around every once in a while. The game has ingenious writing that expertly mixes comedy with emotional moments. The combat is simple but approachable, and for me was fun the entire time despite me mostly relying on blocking towards the end. The soundtrack is great and the art style somehow manages to nail the colorful and dark environments perfectly. I may have some criticism, mostly coming from the difficulty and some random performance issues, but otherwise I have nothing but praise for this game, and it is an easy recommendation from me if this video hasn't already intrigued you. I mentioned earlier that the game is on Game Pass, and that's only $1 for your first month if you're a new subscriber. So you can play Another Crab's Treasure and hundreds of other games for one measly buckaroo. It's also available on every platform, so you have no excuse not to play it. The game took me about 20 hours to beat on my first playthrough. I didn't get 100%, but I did do a lot of the side content. So there's plenty of things to do here, and I definitely think it's worth the $30 price tag if you're not playing on Game Pass. Even though this year isn't even halfway done, I honestly think this might be my game of the year for 2024. The more I think about the game, the more I adore it, and I can totally see myself coming back again and again for repeat playthroughs. You need to play Another Crab's Treasure. Thank you guys so much for watching till the end of this video, it truly means a lot. Originally this video was going to be a small little, me just talking about the game because I really liked it, and as you can see it blossomed into the second longest video on my channel. But I'm really proud of it, and I'm really happy with what I made here, and this honestly might be like the most proud I've ever been with a video. I think the fact that I was also able to make the entire thing from like scripting to posting it right now in like under 2 weeks was also just really cool to me. So yeah, now that my summer's here, my exams are over, everything, is here, I am thinking about trying to post a lot over the summer. I have 3 big videos kind of in the scope similar to this one, and I want to try to get one out every month during the summer. So one in June, one in July, one in August. That's my plan right now. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to stick to that, but we'll see. I'm not going to say what the videos are just in case I don't end up making them or something happens. I just don't want to promise that they're going to come out when I haven't even started yet. But yeah, in between those big uploads, I also want to have smaller ones. I have one plan that I want to come out within like the next 2 weeks maybe, about the Steam Deck, because I bought a Steam Deck about a month ago. So if you are interested in that, subscribe and stay tuned. I want to try to stick to like one video every 2 weeks over the summer because I have some smaller ideas for videos as well, and then just have the big uploads kind of sprinkled in there. And yeah, that's about it for me. Follow the socials, in the description per usual. I'm gonna stop yapping now. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.